Welcome back. Another episode. I'll talk if you'll listen. Episode 70. 7-0. How about that? How about that? What's going on, y'all? I hope y'all had a great 2 weeks since the last time I talked to you all. Last week was not fun as I had to deal with the Sixers Game 7 loss. And a part of me, I'm like, I didn't record the podcast because of this. You know, everything, when you look back on it, you can look at it with a different perspective. Hopefully, we'll actually be talking a lot about that this episode. We won't be talking about many topics. I think, honestly, there's only two things I really want to talk to you all about. But I really want to kind of key in and focus on this stuff because I don't know how often this happens for a lot of people. But speaking of last week, so I don't really go out as much as I used to since the whole pandemic thing, obviously, and even, or rather, I should say, since I've gotten vaccinated. But starting to let loose a little bit, trying to be mindful, especially considering I'm not around other people. So, and I'm vaccinated, so I'm okay. So, I get hit up from a buddy. A buddy hits me up. He's like, my buddy Ryan. I spoke about Ryan to many of you before. So my buddy Ryan's even actually been featured on the podcast here. So I spoke to Ryan. I'm on the phone, Ryan. And we're really hype. I told him how hype I get about basketball around playoff season. We're both rooting for the Sixers, obviously, as our hometown team, which, in my opinion, is the best way. The only time you get a pass is if your team doesn't have a hometown team. Like a lot of people in North and South Dakota, they're Green Bay or the Green Bay Packers or Minnesota Vikings fans due to proximity. But I think that's the only pass you really get. Like a lot of people from Carolina before the Panthers came, a lot of people from North and South Carolina rooted for the Falcons or the Cowboys or other teams from Florida, like the Buccaneers or the Dolphins, for example, because they didn't have a team. Especially when you find yourself in a spot where not only do you not have a team, but you're at least one or two states away from a team that does have a team. It can get really, really tough. So obviously, like take Virginia, for example. Virginia has no professional NFL team. I don't even know if they have a hockey team, but I don't follow hockey that much. I know they got the Charlotte Hornets as a basketball team. And I don't even know if there's a baseball team for Virginia. But you got Virginia, they're really close to Maryland and D.C. So obviously, if they're, in a baseball, you got a Washington Nationals. Or if I think hockey, they're called the Capitals, if I'm not mistaken. Football, you got the Washington football team, formerly known as the Washington Redskins. And you have the Baltimore Ravens, which, if I'm not mistaken, they came around in 2000. They used to be the Baltimore Colts, and now they're the Baltimore Ravens. So, or at least the city's football team. So, sometimes that's understandable. You're in Virginia, you're going to be a Washington sports team fan, a Washington, D.C. sports team fan, or a Maryland sports team fan, et cetera, et cetera. But you find yourself in states like Dakota, one of the Dakotas, north or south, or you find yourself in like, I don't know, I can't think of any other states off the top of my head right now. But you find yourself in a state that doesn't have a professional sports team of a certain sport. Let's just call it the Big Four. You find yourself rooting for other things, but although there are reasons for certain people to like, and I can understand that. Like, so here's an example for me. I grew up in LA/Oakland Raiders fan, and the reason for that is because I was a kid and I played Pop Warner football, and I played for the Northwest Raiders. It's a football team exclusive to the Germantown section of Philadelphia, and we had the same logo and name of the professional sports NFL team, the Oakland Raiders, LA Raiders, depending on what year you go back to. So in my mind, I said that team has the same logo is I do. I had no concept of geography. Like I had no concept of where Oakland saying the Oakland Raiders to me was just like okay. Like I don't know what that like I get what Raiders are, but okay, what somewhere in the US. They're in the NFL. That's all I really knew or care about. And whenever I had my sports games, the NFL 2Ks, the quarterback clubs, the Maddens, even the blitzes, the NFL blitz, I will always play with the Raiders. Tim Brown, Rich Gannon, I will always play with the Raiders. Then I got a little bit older when I finally got a sense of where I was from. And I'm like, oh, Philadelphia Eagles, okay. And I kind of started associating locations to teams, and eventually I never looked back. I became an Eagles fan. I remember almost to the day when I became or to the year when I became an Eagles fan, but I became an Eagles fan, and that was all she wrote. So that time that I was a Raiders fan, I would give that version of me a pass because I had no concept. And I probably would have remained a Raiders fan much longer if I got a chance to see those teams on the big screen. But because they were nowhere near our market, unless they were playing a team on the East Coast for some reason, I never got to see a Raiders game anyway. Now, although I can understand somebody being a Cowboys or Giants or Washington football team fan because they're market teams. So if an Eagles game isn't on, you're probably going to see a game from one of those teams. They're in our division, so clearly we want to know what's going on. So I get that. But I think I never really fully understood the concept of committing to that team. I always considered it, if you were raised in a house where that was the favorite team, I get it. I have a friend whose family is from Georgia, the like a suburb of Atlanta, and they moved up here. His parents were in the military and they bounced around and they ended up moving up here, but they were from, let's just say, Atlanta. They were from Atlanta, so they were Falcons fans, and he grew up a Falcons fan. Now, of course, it helped getting Mike Vick. He was a superstar. How could you not like Mike Vick? You played with him on Madden. He was on the cover of Madden 04. He was literally the human video game character. So I get that. He was very appealing. A lot of star power there. Plus, their uniforms were cool. I always thought their uniforms were super dope. I get that. I get that being an Atlanta Falcons fan. You grew up in a Falcons household. But if you're like a Lakers fan, a Celtics fan, I like to think that you're fans of these franchises just because they were successful. That's it. And you wanted to be associated with a winning franchise. Your team wasn't relevant. Your city wasn't relevant. So every time you watch the playoffs, literally Magic Johnson and Larry Bird of the LA Lakers and Boston Celtics respectively were quite literally in every NBA finals. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the basketball or sports in general, the NBA championship, to say you're basically world champions, occurs at the end of every season. And after every year from 80 to 89, Magic Johnson of the LA Lakers or Larry Bird of the Boston Celtics were in the championship game. So if you grew up in the 80s, let's say you were born in the 70s, but you grew up in the 80s, you're constantly seeing the Lakers and the Celtics being smashed down your face. Of course, you're going to grow an affinity toward, you're not really hearing anything, about the Sixers. I mean, we won the one championship back in, I think it was 83, maybe 81 or 83, one of those odd years. We won, but we were in the finals against, these teams. So you take a look at it and you go, well, hey, if this team is winning, I want to be a part of that team. But sorry about that. I don't even know how I got on that tangent. But anyway, Sixers. So I go and I'm watching the Sixers last week. My buddy Ryan hits me up. He's like, hey, let's go and watch the game. My lodge brother hits me up. He's like, yo, I'm going to be out here at this my spot watching the game. So me and Ryan, we go and chill with my lodge brother, and we sitting down watching the game, and it was just like so disappointing on so many levels. For me, because I skipped recording the podcast to watch the Sixers lose. So of course it would have been worth it if they won, but they lost. So it was like that was all she wrote. But I want to talk about something today that is really, really serious, and this conversation kind of happened by accident. And I want to start off by saying this. This is a conversation that is going to be very sensitive for some people because it involves race. And if you're easily offended or if you find that race is a tough topic for you, I first would say you can't grow and change your belief system or challenge or even reaffirm your belief system or perspective if you don't challenge other people's perspective. So I do encourage you to listen because it could kind of open your thought process or change your perspective when it comes to certain things. But that said, now's your time to stop listening. I told Dave Chappelle, one of the people that I look up to the most, I once heard him say, "You clicked on my face and you kept watching." And I kind of stand by that. You know, when you're in a platform like this, when you're in a forum like this, when you have any sense of publicity, whether that be 1 or 2 people listening or 1 or 2 million people listening, some would say you have a responsibility and an obligation to stay away from certain things. I like to think that no one is forced to watch a show. No one is forced to listen to a podcast. No one is forced to, even in some cases, work certain. You may feel like you have to work somewhere. But no one's holding a gun to you, at least as far as I know. No one's holding a gun to your head and saying, hey, you have to work here. Now, granted, you could always make the case that, hey, if I quit, I'm screwed. Okay, but that's a different discussion. The discussion here is, the point here is, you don't have to. No one's forcing you to. So if you feel like you can't be a part of this discussion surrounding race and maturity and growth, now's your time to stop listening and understand that it's never my intent to offend anyone. I always say if someone's offended by anything that I say or do, it's totally by circumstance and it's totally by accidents. That's just a consequence of the scenario. So if you're offended, it wasn't my intent, but at the same time, you clicked on the podcast. So you have to share some responsibility there too. I was recently having a discussion with a friend of mine, really, really close friend of mine. And we just got to talking, and as with all like my 4 closest friends, we oftentimes get into discussions of philosophy. What does this mean, or why do we think that way? And we were in a conversation, and he said, in another life, or if things would have worked out differently, he would have found himself in a relationship with a white woman. And he broke down why, which I'll get to in a second. But I totally empathize with that. And just for perspective, both, if you don't know already, I'm black. And my friend, the one that I'm talking to, he's black. So he says he would have definitely dated a white woman. Now, I know a lot of people will hear that, especially if you're a black woman. You'll turn your nose up at that and you'll stop listening to the podcast, or you won't even entertain this discussion. I'd argue that this is the point of the discussion where you got to make a decision. Do you shut down, you don't listen to the why the person feels this way or thinks this way, and you just write this person off as an enemy? Or do you kind of sit on your judgment, you have your feelings, but you listen to understand where this is coming from? Because I like to think a lot of people, black women in particular, but a lot of people, when they hear something that don't like, they kind of automatically just write it off. And you want to kind of take a step back and listen. A lot of my friends, black women included, I like to think that we are close because they take the time and take a step back and listen to it. First person that immediately come to mind are both my friends by the name of Jaleesa. Coincidentally, they have the exact same name. I won't drop their full name just for the sake of privacy. But one of them actually had a different last name, like her maiden last name is different, but then got married and now has the exact same last name as my friend that I went to high school with. But they're both of their names is Jaleesa, and they're very open-minded individuals. In fact, one of the Jaleesas in particular only chooses to have certain conversations with me and people like me because she knows, like, hey, this might rock the boat a little bit, and most people don't think this way or believe this, so I wouldn't necessarily get on a public platform and say this. And I appreciate that about her. So that's even more reason why I get frustrated when, in general, most people, whether it be black women, Asian women, black men, Hispanic men, whatever, old men, younger men, they'll hear something that instantly that they disagree with, or they don't like, or they feel personally attacked. They can't take themselves out of the thing or the topic. They feel personally attacked, and they can't entertain a discussion. So I can understand some people shutting down right there. I don't like it, but I can understand it. But my friend was like, yeah, if I had to do this all over again, I would date a white woman. Or if I have another opportunity, I'm going to date a white woman. And he explained why. Basically, he finds white women really attractive. And he said he was never exposed to that before. He never had the opportunity to do that before. And I heard a lot of myself in what he was saying. So I let him finish, but basically his key points were all he knows is black women. He's never gotten a chance to date outside of his race before. That's all he grew up around. That's all he went to school with. That's all he's ever dated. And he also, coincidentally, just finds them so attractive. Now I'm going to take a step back and tell you why I heard myself and saw myself in him in that moment during that discussion. So for those of you who don't know, I'm going to take you down memory lane with me. So I grew up in a dense urban environment. I grew up in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. If you're not familiar, it's right above North Philly. In fact, most people south of Center City even consider Germantown North Philly. That's how close it is, and that's how similar it is. And there was one white man on my block. And in fact, my mother didn't like me hanging around him. And to this day, and I'll never know why because my mother passed, but to this day, I will never know why. But this white man was so kind to me. He was really cool. He taught me riddles. He played chess with me. He taught me, like, he in fact got me into chess, which I'm really grateful for. But apparently he maybe had some sort of reputation that I didn't know about because I was too young to know about. But he was an old man. His name was Bob, Mr. Bob. Of course it was, right? Of course it was Bob. But, you know, he was the first white person that I met that I have a memory of that wasn't a school teacher. So in my mind, I only ever saw white people at school. They were adults. And on TV. The first time I ever saw a white kid, like, or a white peer or teen or whoever, you know, someone my age, was in high school. In person anyway, was in high school. And it could have been before that, but I was so ignorant to it that I maybe didn't even notice. But as I mentioned earlier in the episode, I played Pop Warner football, no white kids there. I lived in the neighborhood, traveled all around, no white kids there. And unless I was watching TV, again, no white kids to be seen, to be heard of, to be found. So all I knew was black. All I knew was black. And when I finally started getting into girls, of course, probably really like around. I mean, I was aware of them, but I really probably didn't start getting into them till like 3rd or 4th grade. And I had a crush, and I'm gonna say her name because she's a model, so I'm sure she'll appreciate the publicity. By the name of Shamir Washington. And if you went to elementary school with me, or if you grew up in my neighborhood, you know exactly who I'm talking about. And I had the biggest crush on her. That was my first actual crush. Black woman, light skinned woman, black woman. From there, I went to middle school, and of course, I was obsessed with a lot of women in middle school. But that's when I had my first, like, I don't want to say real girlfriend, but my first girlfriend that it was like more of than a just I like you, you like me type of thing. We actually, quote unquote, if you want to call it dating. And my first crush, well, my middle school crush, I'm not going to put her on blast. I'm not going to put her on blast. If you want to know who it is, you can hit me up. But you're only going to know who it is if you went to middle school with me. If you went to Hill Freeman with me. If you didn't go to middle school with me, you're not going to know who I'm talking about. But very beautiful woman. Everybody in school knew I had a crush on her. Black woman. My first real girlfriend, who, again, I'm not going to say on here, that I dated for 9 months. So my first real relationship. First woman or girl at the time that I ever said I loved you to. Black woman. So every romantic and every major romance that I've had since that point, and I started dating that young lady, the one I'm just talking, I started dating her going into 9th grade. So I started dating her May of my 8th grade year, and we broke up in December of my 9th, so my first year of high school. And every woman after that, black woman. So that's all I knew. So I started to have this thought process, and I'm about to get really, really deep, y'all. And again, if this is too much for y'all, this is going to get borderline offensive. So I encourage you, if you can't have this open-minded discussion, to just stop listening right now. You've been warned several times at this point. So I got my heart broken by the young lady that I was dating in high school. And every other woman after that broke up with me. You know, I wasn't the type of guy they wanted. I wasn't as popular, whatever. They say nice guys finish last. Now, looking back on it as an adult, I could probably point out specific things. And I can also look back, hey, we just didn't work. It wasn't this person's type, But at the time, I didn't know that. At the time, it was just women are cruel. Women are B words, and I didn't want to deal with them beyond just sex, because it kind of got to the point. So the next woman that I dated, seriously dated, because I did date another girl in high school, but it wasn't really serious, and I could tell I wasn't moving fast enough for her. I think she wanted somebody. I think she was looking for sex, and I just wasn't there yet. I didn't lose my virginity yet. I didn't know how to make that move. So anyway, different story for a different time. So then I come across the young lady that I lose my virginity to. And for all intents and purposes, girl of my dreams, like tomboyish, wasn't too girly, was just super cool. But that didn't work out. I'm not going to say why, because I want to put her on blast. But it didn't work out. But I was always the one losing in all of the relationships that I've been a part of between, let's just say 9th grade, because that was like my first real relationship, I'd say, because it lasted longer than like weeks. So that's from 9th grade up until now, I was always on the losing end. I was always on, they made fun of me. They broke up with me. They cheated on me. They didn't want to show me any time of day. They had attitudes. They didn't respect me. It was so many different things. It got to the point where the first thing I did was I thought it was me. I'm like, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What's going on? And now, then eventually, I kind of got to the point where I was like, well, it's women, just all women. And this is before I was fully aware of like white women from a romantic standpoint. I, of course, had fantasies about celebrities and had celebrity crushes and stuff, but those weren't realistic people. In my mind, they were like not even real. I wouldn't even know what to do if I saw them in person. So in my mind, the only women that existed were black women. Now, my girlfriend that I met in high school, she was half Mexican, half black, because her mother was Mexican, but for all intents and purposes, she was black. She walked the walk, talked the talk, identified as black. You know, her father was very much in her life, and he was black. So, for all intents and purposes, she was black. So, all I knew was black women. So, eventually, once I moved past the phase of it's all women, well, before it's all women, it's me, I'm the problem. I need to change the way I talk. I need to change the way I dress. I need to change the way I act. Then when I saw that not even that helped, I realized that it's women. You know, it's just women. And then once I started becoming aware of non-black women as romantic options, I started to think, well, it's black women. Black women, they're the problem. I did not have a positive example of black women in my life consistently. The biggest, most positive influence in my life from a black woman standpoint were two people: my older cousin Angel and my grandmother, my late grandmother. Now, and I'll throw my Aunt Celeste in there too, and I'll tell you why in a second. Starting with Angel, she nurtured me. She wasn't that much older than I was. She nurtured me, she watched me, she took care of me. And we had a from a familial standpoint, like from family, very intimate connection. You know, I loved her. She basically like my older sister, and in some cases, very motherly. And I like to think that me, and along with maybe a few other cousins, was her introduction into motherhood, because she made sure we were fed. She made sure we had places to sleep. She made sure we had places to stay, and we didn't go hungry around. I'm eternally grateful for her, and I probably don't tell her enough. I don't think I ever could. Second person, my grandmother, very wise, wisest black woman that I ever met before I got into masonry, because there's some damn good, like the women in masonry, the Order of the Eastern Star. That's next level. That's like the epitome of class right there. But my grandmother was just so wise, and it always was able to teach me lessons without me even looking for them or being aware of them. Some stuff didn't hit until like days later. She'll tell me something, and then like days later, I'm like, oh snap, wow. And then my Aunt Celeste, she was very nurturing. She took a lot of pride of her home. She wanted to make sure her home was in order. She took a lot of pride in ownership. She took a lot of pride in her job. She took a lot of pride in her ability to raise 4 boys. She's very, very strong. One of the strongest women that I know. So those were the 3 closest images that I had for positive black women in my life, that I could relate to and look up to. But I didn't get those consistently, because those women were on my father's side, and I only ever saw them when I was in my father's custody. And of course, after my father passed, when I went down there on my own, of my own will, and hung out with them. So the majority of the time, my mother, she was not a positive, and I won't bash her at all. I'm not going to get on this platform and bash her. That wouldn't be right. But I will say, I would be very honest and transparent with all of you and say, she wasn't a positive black female role model for me. So she had the most influence over my perception of black women. So between my mother and between all the women that broke my heart, I just was under the impression it was just black women. Only black women are like this. I associated every negative thing to black women. And I know that's really, really hard for a lot of people to hear. Trust me, the story gets better. And I'm hoping that you can hear the growth throughout my transformation from a teenager to a young adult to where I am now. Because right now I adore black women, obviously. In fact, you all do too. One of my highest downloaded episodes was my first and only episode that featured all black female guest list. So I adore black women now. But there was a time that, I'm not too proud to say, but I'm able to acknowledge and understand. I'm thankful that I went through because I think it was really important for my development. Where I did not like black women at all. I thought they were the problem. You know, I would sleep with them. I would hang out with them. I would get really close to them for some friends, people that I would adore. But when it came to, it was only in a romantic light. So if it was family or if it was friends, I didn't look at them as negative things, like negative people. Um, I didn't associate those negative things with them. But when romance was the option, it was like no, not at all. So we'll fast forward to a young lady that I started dating right out of high school. I took her on my prom, and I was really, really close with her. I knew her for years at this point because I basically grew up with her, and I was close to her like no other. But I'm not going to say what happened. I don't want people put people's business out there. But you know what I should do? I should come out with a Patreon, and y'all, and if you want the access to the exclusive stories, then you pay a certain Patreon membership fee or something. Because a part of me knows that this is stuff that's like really important for context. Like if I told you all this story, you'd understand why I had the perspective that I do. But if any and everyone has access to something, there's nothing stopping from anybody from. Of course, you got to make the decision to like search for the podcast, but there's nothing stopping anyone from listening to this podcast. And it's free. Doesn't cost you a dime. But if you go out of your way to pay the patron like membership fee to listen to a story, at that point I got to give you the goods. You know what I mean? So maybe if I get enough feedback from y'all, Charles and Amanda in particular are really good at giving me ideas for the show. I really encourage everybody else who listens. There's some of you who listen. I've never even spoken to you before. I think that's super dope and super cool. But please, 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 like reach out to me and give me some ideas for Patreon. I would love to hear from you. But this young lady really, really had a huge, negative impact on my perception of black women. She, I want to tell a story for context, but she really hurt me. She really, really hurt me. In fact, I blame, she's one of 3 women that I put a lot of, that had the biggest impact on my perception of women in general, in particular black women. That did not end well. That was pretty, that would have a negative impact years after. Then I had my next girlfriend, and I was out of high school at this point. She was in high school. We dated for, I think like 8 months, 9 months. I went on her prom, and she straight up told me like, but so many words. She couldn't articulate at the time. I mean, she was 18 years old. But she told me like basically I wasn't her type. I wasn't the guy she was looking for. Now, in retrospect, even if I was, it wouldn't have worked out. But that hurt me too, because I'm thinking, I'm just being me. I'm being everything that I know how to be. I'm being everything that I think y'all want, and I'm still getting the short end of the stick here. So I had countless, romantic relationships, and then, but I never got into a serious relationship. And just like everything, clearly it's something that I was or wasn't doing, but I was at a point where I wasn't mature enough to kind of do that self-reflection without getting depressed. Because it wouldn't go to, okay, what do I need to do better? What was it? I wouldn't treat it like a job, right? If a woman didn't find me interesting, I wouldn't ask her about it. Like, hey, what was it about me you didn't like? Or what could I have done differently? Like, I wasn't there from a maturation standpoint. So if I ever did any self-reflection, it would be, I'm not good enough. It would be, I'm not good enough. I'll never find love. I'll never be the guy that women want. It was never the productive type of self-reflection. So I had, countless romantic relationships, all didn't really end well. And I finally got to the point, I remember working on a college campus. And for the first time is when I saw 9 black women as a romantic option. I mean, these women would come in, these college women would come in and they would just look gorgeous. And then it was the attraction of the fact that they're just naturally attractive. Like the women that would come in were just attractive. Just like there are, were black women that I wasn't attracted to. Of course, there were white women and Hispanic women and Asian women that I wasn't attracted to. But in general, I'm attracted to women. So more often than not, attractive women or women that I would be attracted to will come in. And I worked at a specialty video game retailer. So if they were coming in for themselves, that was just an extra checkbox that was checked, because now you're coming in and you like what I like. So now I'm even more attracted to you. They were fit in most cases. They were very, social. I liked everything about them. But what I didn't realize, what was going on subconsciously, is on a scale of 1 to 10, if they were like a 7 or an 8, they were being bumped up to like an 8 or a 9, 9.5, because it was new. I had never experienced non-black women as a romantic option before. Never. So it's kind of like a TV show or some food. If you're only ever eating the same thing and then you go and have something fresh for the first time, or you're watching a new show for the first time, you're going to go, ooh, what is this? So my interest was piqued. And I started having different, whether it be certain things like, flirtation, or whether it be certain things like romantic relationships. I started to explore that realm a little bit. And none of them ever went as far as like sex or anything like that. But I did start to, I got close enough with them to understand that, okay, this is going somewhere, right? And the more exposure I got, I started to have a revelation that it's like, it's not just black women that have these negative things. It's women, or it's people from this area. Of course it's men too, but ladies, I'm not attacking you. I'm just speaking from a heterosexual male's perspective. That I was able to get to the point of maturation and growth where I realized it's not just women from Germantown. It's not just women from Philly. It's not just women from South Jersey. It's not just black women. It's women. You're either going to find some that are like a certain way or they aren't like a certain way. All of them, fellas and ladies who are lesbians listening, all of them have an attitude. All of them do. All of them had an attitude. All of them are picky in certain ways. All of them give you sass. All of them have standards. All of them are, rude in some areas or not so rude. All of them are timid. All of them are sensitive. All of them are passionate. All of them are fun. All of them are, almost all of them are intelligent. It's just like guys. Some guys are jerks, some guys aren't. Some guys are nice, some guys aren't. And it took me to get to like my mid-20s to like really realize that it's not just a thing. So a thing with one particular type of woman from a specific area. That's why right now I find it so sad to hear when I hear any of my friends going, bro, I got to get out of Philly, man. I got to start dating women from here, because these Philly women are da-da-da-da. Okay, there might be some similarities amongst all Philly women, but what makes you think that's exclusive to Philadelphia? And I'm really glad I went through that process, because I was able to have a revelation, an epiphany, if you will. And it really helped to change my perspective. And then we get to the current I'm skipping a lot of things, but we get into my current relationship. There are a lot of things I deal with that I like and that I don't like. And it just gets you to know, like, hey, look, as long as I am dealing with another human being, this is going to happen. Even if I was gay or bi or whatever, and I was dating a guy, I would come across the same thing. It would be, they don't like certain shows or they don't like certain music, and it would be a thing. And it really kind of got to the point where I woke up, and I'm really glad that I did. And I was able to share that with my friend, that, hey, you want a white woman because it's new. You were never exposed to that. Every school you went to had black women. Every school. You only lived in one neighborhood, nothing but black women. And you, just like I, were only ever exposed to white people or white women, especially ones that you were attracted to, in magazines and books and comics and shows, TV shows, music videos, music, and as teachers. Or not teachers, I'll just say adults. But we all know we had some fine teachers in high school. We all know that. But that's it. That's all we really got to see. So I was able to empathize with them there, and I totally understood it. And it'd be real easy for me to get on my high horse and be like, "Oh, bro, that's messed up," blah 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 blah. Right? And I think a lot of people do that. They hear something that they don't like, and they automatically get this holier than thou attitude, get on their soapbox and tell them like how you need to do this and feel this way and think this way. But I had my moments of confusion too. I just sat here and told you all I thought all black women were like negative. That was very ignorant, very inconsiderate, and very narrow-minded of myself. But I needed to have that experience to realize what I'm able to realize now, and be able to appreciate or understand what's a challenge now. I think that's really important. The conversation also shifted to another area surrounding culture and privilege, and I think you all will really, really like this. It was very introspective, and I'm going to get into it on the other side of this break. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for bearing with me through that break. So, culture and privilege. There were a lot of things that I realized about those two things being in an interracial relationship. And you learn a lot about how culture and privilege can end up impact you, especially if you're a black man who grew up in inner city Philadelphia. And there were a lot of unconscious biases and things that I did not like that were not brought to the surface until I got into this relationship and experienced certain things, and until I started going through therapy. Therapy is so important. You learn so much about yourself. And here's the thing about therapy. You're not the same person you were yesterday. And problems don't go away until you deal with them. And I would argue that even if you deal with them, even if you resolve them, they're still there because they're still a part of you, who you are. And they shape your perspective. And they influence your decisions. We just got finished talking about how my experiences with black women and women in general shaped my perspective and experience when it came to every other romantic relationship after that. Imagine if I had been in therapy after my first time my heart got broken. That would have been huge. And a part of me feels bad for every other woman that kind of had to deal with my growing pains because I wasn't mature enough to understand, or I was too ignorant. I didn't lack the knowledge. I lacked the knowledge to take advantage of my health insurance and get some therapy and try to work some things out, especially some unresolved issues with my mom. And a lot of women suffer for that. And if suffered is too strong of a word, they at least had to deal with it. I know the relationship that I'm currently in, my girlfriend has to deal with certain things that I may not even be aware of. It could just be a part of my makeup because I've been subjected to it. But one thing I will say about therapy is it's made me much more self-aware. And I'm realizing now how important culture is when it comes to relationships and how important privilege is when it comes to appreciation of those relationships. So during the same discussion with this friend, I started to tell him that the two barriers and two hurdles that he'll have to deal with is culture and privilege. Of course, he asked me to elaborate, and I gave some personal examples. So in my current relationship, my girlfriend and I are from two different parts of the state. We grew up with two different realities, two different lifestyles, and there were a lot of different factors. Just to name a few, she went to school in the suburbs. I went to school in the inner city. She grew up in a household with all her family. There was family togetherness, and both her parents were in the same household. I didn't. She grew up with a good chunk of her life with her father owning their home. Of course, he had a mortgage, so can't really say he owned it because he's paying the bank off, but you know what I mean. versus my mom had to live on, subsidized housing. She had to go through resources of human development. So there were a lot of things. My mom only ever she drove me to my father and my father's side of the family when it was custody, when they had custody. And for like my first year in middle school, she drove me to middle school. But after that, I didn't have the opportunity to get rides anywhere, and kind of basically had to beg my mom for certain things. And all that kind of like was normal in my neighborhood. So you kind of just you don't realize how much of an advantage or disadvantage certain people are or are not, because when everybody around you for the most part is the same, you view privilege different. So for example, my godparents and god brothers and sisters there, whenever I would go over there, they had a huge kitchen, and their kitchen was stocked full of all types of snacks and food. Little did I know that their parents were on food stamps too. The difference is, well, their mother, because their father wasn't around. Just like, well, in their house, their father wasn't around. Just like in my house, my father wasn't there. My mother was. Come to find out, she just got more food stamps because there were more kids there. So she was able to purchase more. But from my perspective, privilege was, oh, you got the cereal that I want. Or privilege was, oh, you got the video game system that I want. Or you got more school uniforms than I do. In my mind, that's what privilege was. I could not comprehend or even begin to comprehend what it was like to have both parents in the house. I couldn't comprehend or begin to comprehend what it was like to have, parents who could take you to and fro. I couldn't comprehend what it was like to have certain options for schooling when you're in the suburbs. Now, that's not to say it's all roses and peaches in the suburbs. It's not. My girl definitely had her fair share of challenges. But the difference is her challenges were different than mine. So there's a empathy gap there. There's certain things that we can't relate to. And that's when culture and privilege come into play. Now, this is more privilege as a result of the culture. And I'll get into more examples of culture impactfulness in a second. But when it came to privilege in particular, I found myself resenting certain things that my girlfriend had access to. And I would get moody or upset about it and not know why. And it took me a while to realize it. Example. So, any of my fellow men listening know that we take pride in being needed. Men psychologically want to feel useful. So if our girlfriends or mothers or sisters, any other woman who may depend on us for something, we like that. We take pride in that. Whether it's something as simple as taking the jar off of the pickle jar, taking the top off the pickle jar, or fixing something around the house. Now, I have a very low level of insecurity about a lot of different things. So I knew it wasn't insecurity. I knew it wasn't me feeling emasculated as a man whenever my girlfriend would go to her father for certain things. And in a way, I kind of like that, because just like what I just said, her father wants to feel needed. How many fathers out there watch their daughter grow up and now they're in the care of another man? They feel like, okay, well, I have no value now. I'm useless. So I like the fact that she would rely on her father for certain things. However, I found that before it turned into resentment, it was, why are you going to him for that? I just don't understand. Then it kind of got to the point where I would resent the fact that she would go to her father for certain things before going to me, as if I wasn't necessarily capable of doing it. I never figured it out until something else happened, where she mentioned that her mother offered to give her a ride about something. And I didn't say it out loud, but I remember in my head, must be nice. I remember thinking that, must be nice. And I remember getting in the mood, being a little annoyed, and not knowing why. So I took some time to think about it, and I realized I resent the fact that she has that option. that she can go to her parents and ask for help. I never had that option, even when my mother was living. My father wasn't always accessible because my mother was like the gatekeeper. And I'm sure a lot of you, especially if you have kids, can understand that when the mother has custody, and especially if the relationship didn't end well and there was a lot of bitterness going on, the mother is kind of like the gateway to like interaction with the father. So there were a lot of different things that I didn't get access to, my dad. And if and when my dad did offer money, my mom got it. I didn't see any of that. So I didn't really have access to my father. And then he passed away when I was 11. So I really didn't have much opportunity to lean on him anyway. I never had the opportunity to lean on my mom because she either didn't have the resources or she was too irresponsible for me to rely on her. So I had to become very independent very quickly. I moved out at 18. I had my own apartment. I had several apartments. I did everything on my own. I got around on my own. I navigated the city on my own. I got a job on my own. I got my own promotions. There were a lot of things. I bought my own clothes. There were a lot of things that I had to do on my own. So when I found myself in scenarios where she could just go to her father or her mother for certain things, and I would get annoyed, it took a while and a lot of help. A shout out to our therapist, our counselor, for helping me to recognize resentment so easily. I realized, like, it's not that I feel insecure or I'm mad at her that she didn't come to me or nothing. It's that I didn't have that option. I am 2 or 3 rent payments away from homelessness. I could reach out to a lodge brother who could probably put me on their couch for a week or two. I have a friend, 2 close friends in Texas that I could probably lean on and rent a room for a little bit. I have some other friends who I could probably stay with them a little bit. They have guest rooms. Hey, can I stay with you until I get back on my feet? But living with them is not an option at all. Like I have to, I'm 2 to 3 rent payments away from homelessness. When you say that out loud, do you know what type of pressure that puts you on to perform? Oh, I'd be damned if a rent payment ain't getting paid. 2 to 3 payments away from homelessness. She, under extreme scenarios or circumstances, can go back with her parents. And that's great. And that's where we as a Black community kind of got to focus on. We want to set our children up to where they're not failing, and we want to give them that backbone and that foundation. And that's something for me to kind of look to. And you know what? I want to be that for somebody, whether it be little cousins, nieces, nephews, whatever. They get in the pinch, they can lean on Uncle Tim or Cousin Tim and be able to stay with me for a few months until they get back on their feet. I like that. And it's something to aspire to. But up until I realized what I realized, I'd be lying if I sat here and told you that I didn't resent that fact. That her and I could break up, or a meteor could hit the apartment and we could have no place to stay and she can go back to her parents, no problem. So things like that privilege comes into play when you are in a relationship, especially from someone that you're dating outside of your normal circumstance. And that's not limited to race. I know in my case, it's I'm dating someone outside of my race, but that's not limited to race. If you are growing up in an underprivileged neighborhood and you're dating someone who was on a higher, whose parents were in a higher tax bracket or had more privilege than you, you're going to experience that. And I had to tell that to my friend, of whom I was having this conversation with, that, hey, look, there's going to be certain scenarios where, certain things are going to happen. And your girlfriend, odds are, not to say that, white people don't have challenges, but they have different types of challenges than Black people do, especially my friend, because I know how my friend grew up. He's going to come across certain things where at first you're going to go, oh, that's nice. And you're going to look at it as like, oh, this is an advantage. This is cool. But eventually you're going to start to kind of like feel less than, especially when certain things come up like, hey, what do you mean you don't have this? Or what do you mean you don't have that? What do you mean you don't have X amount of dollars saved in your savings account? Or you don't own X amount of stock? Those conversations are going to come up in some way, shape, or form. What do you mean everyone in your family doesn't have a car? What do you mean this or what do you mean that? it's kind of like, oh, what do you mean your parents don't have a beach house? It's going to feel a certain kind of way. You're going to start to feel these things, and resentment is an ugly thing. It's going to slowly start to rear its ugly head, and it can ruin relationships from the inside out. The second thing when it comes to culture, I'm going to go through this really quickly. I talked you guys' ears off, and I'm going to leave the floor open for discussion for throughout the week for social media. When you want to hit me up on social media, but culture plays a part too, because I feel, and this isn't news to my girlfriend. I told her this. I try my very best to have discussions with her, so it's not news to her on the podcast in general. But there are certain things where culturally, like we don't like the same. Culturally, we don't listen to the same music. Culturally, we didn't grow up on the same shows, so I can't necessarily make a reference about Martin or something. Culturally, we didn't have the same teenage angsty experiences. So my teenage puberty angst and experiences are different from hers. Not only in just being a guy and a girl, but just being growing up in two different parts. Me growing up in inner city and her growing up in the suburbs. Just different experiences, you know. So there's a certain disconnect there that kind of will linger, and it can cause envy, it can cause jealousy, and if you don't manage it as best you can, it can really ruin a relationship from the inside out, just like resentment can. Because what'll start to happen is, I have a few female friends that I'm really, really close with. One that immediately comes to mind is my friend Jasmine. Really, really close to her. I've known her for going on 10 years now, if not 10 years already. And I can hear her up. I can talk to her about certain things, certain career-oriented things. I can talk to her about music. I can talk to her about shows. I can hear her up and say, hey, remember that one episode of Martin? Or without even dropping, another clue or hint. Just quote a song. She could say something or something. I could just quote a song that we grew up wanting to listen to. And there's that instant connection. I don't have that with my girlfriend. So it'll be really easy and in some cases very understandable for someone in her position to think like, oh, I could lose him to Jasmine. Now, of course, my friend Jasmine is engaged, so it might not be a great example. But in general, if I have a single female friend, one that's not in a relationship, and we grew up in the same area or same neighborhood, went through the same experiences, both went to public school in Philly, and we can bond over certain things, that could start to rear its ugly head as jealousy. Or like, oh, why are you hanging out with her? What are you doing? Out of fear of he and I, we don't bond. We don't bond in that way, but Tim and girl A does. That could potentially come across an issue. And on my end, sometimes I feel like, okay, there's a disconnect there. There's a connection that I will never be able to form with her because we didn't have that experience. And just bringing this all back to the conversation with my friend, I kind of told him about that. Like, hey, look, when you date a white woman, depending on where she's from, depending on where she grew up at, you're increasing the likelihood of that cultural difference from happening. Yeah, she might know some popular songs that you knew growing up. She might know some popular shows that you knew growing up. But there's certain things that she won't know. And even if you date a black woman or in a relationship with a black woman outside of Philadelphia, outside of South Jersey, the tri-state area in general, there are going to be certain things where privilege comes into play. If she had a privileged lifestyle growing up, both the parents in the house, college fund, went to a privileged school, et cetera, or she just grew up, heavy metal rock, or maybe she was super religious, as in the gospel music, and you can't relate to that. There's going to be a cultural difference there. Yeah, there's black culture. So whether you are black in England or you're black in, South America, there's black culture, right? That bonds black people over many barriers. But there's also geographic culture from your same city or neighborhood, culture from your state or part of the country. You're going to be able to bond from being from Philadelphia or Maryland or, Camden or, DC, whatever. you're more likely to bond. You're more likely to bond with somebody from like New York or um uh Boston or something like that than you are to be able to bond with somebody in like Vermont or San Francisco or, and I know I'm naming both cities and states, but I hope you get the point. Or like, certain parts of Ohio or whatever the case may be. You're not going to be able to bond with these people the way you're going to be able to bond with people in dense urban environments. Somebody who grew up in a dense urban environment in, let's say, Baltimore is more likely to bond with somebody in a dense urban environment of, let's say, Houston than someone who lives in Houston will be able to bond with someone who lives in a suburb of Houston. Believe it or not. So there's certain types of connections and strings that kind of happen. And you just kind of got to cherish the bonds that you are able to make and try to understand that being able to bond with your partner in every single last aspect or area of your experience, your life experience, is completely unreasonable. There are certain things that my girl and I can bond over now, and I have to kind of focus on those as a plus than maybe the fact that we don't like certain music or certain shows or certain food or whatever the case may be. So I hope this conversation sparked a lot of thought for a lot of you. And I'm hoping that if you're in a relationship and you're listening, I hope you share this episode with your partner. Just to start to put a spotlight on those differences and try to be aware of them. Because if you aren't aware of them, those differences can really impact your relationship in a negative way. And next thing you know, you'll find yourself being upset or angry or resentful, and you have no idea why. I also encourage couples counseling because it'll really help you not only map out, but discuss and tackle a lot of these different areas. That said, everybody, it was really nice talking to you all for another week, and really proud to hit episode 70. I also started my gym membership. I've gone to the gym on Friday and on Saturday. I took a break today, and my plan is to go tomorrow morning. Another reason why I got to end this episode so I can go tomorrow morning. I'm going to try to go at 6 a.m. That said, everybody, as always, I'll keep talking if you listen. Take care.